Okay, let's unpack this. You know how sometimes a place isn't just geographical coordinates, it's woven into the very fabric of a nation's identity, embodying its spirit, its struggle, its sheer refusal to yield. For the Eritrean people, according to our source, Shabait, that place is Nakfa.
It really is. And what's truly fascinating, as Shabait presents it, is how a physical location, a town, becomes so deeply synonymous with these abstract, powerful national virtues. Shabait doesn't just call it a town. It's highlighted as the foundation of the true state of Eritrea. That's a bold claim that really...
I'm here for this deep dive. We're going to explore the profound significance of Nakfa to the Eritrean people and their long, incredibly arduous struggle for independence. And just to be clear up front, everything we're discussing today, every detail and perspective, it comes directly from our source material, which is Shabait.
That's right. And it's probably good to mention this is the first part of a two-part deep dive into this material from Shabait. Today, we're focusing on Nakfa's powerful symbolism, why it means what it means, and we'll begin tracing the initial phases of the really intense military conflict that came to surround it. We'll take it right up to the immense buildup and the early stages of that massive Sixth Offensive described in the source.
Right, so the mission is to really unpack why Nakfa holds this almost sacred place in Eritrean history. We want to understand its dual role. It's both this potent symbol of resistance and, well, literally a vital physical stronghold. And we'll also start to trace those relentless military efforts focused on trying to capture it, again, all based on Shabait's account.
Yeah, it's about understanding multiple layers here. The meaning, the strategic importance this one location held throughout decades of struggle, at least as depicted by Shabait.
So let's start right there. What does Nakfa represent according to Shabait? It's clearly far more than just, geographic territory.
That's right. Shabait tells us that for every Eritrean, Nakfa holds a special, profound meaning. It's presented as embodying endurance, perseverance, and belief. Think about that for a second. How does a physical spot become shorthand for such fundamental human and national qualities? It's quite something.
It must be tied directly to the experiences lived there, right? The sheer difficulty of holding it, the unwavering hope it represented. Shabait describes it as the very place where the liberation fighters cemented their strong belief and conviction that one day Eritrea will be an independent country, where its people will walk proud as independent and free people in their own land. So it wasn't just some abstract hope, it was a conviction solidified in this specific place.
Precisely. Shabait frames Nakfa as the bedrock, the foundation upon which the very idea of a future independent state was built and crucially defended. It was where that conviction wasn't just held internally, but actively lived out, fought for, reinforced through that intense shared experience.
And Shabait goes even further, describing Nakfa as the foundation of all the successes the EPLF attained until the last day, 24th of May, 1991.
Yeah.
That's an enormous claim. What does Shabait imply by calling it the foundation of all successes?
Well, it suggests, from Shabait's perspective, that Nakfa was the critical nucleus, the indispensable base from which every other victory, every strategic gain, every single step towards independence ultimately flowed. It implies its importance wasn't just about holding a piece of territory, but about providing the strategic stability, the unwavering morale, and the secure operational command posts needed for the entire movement to endure and ultimately succeed over decades of intense conflict. It was the anchor point.
And that strategic and symbolic weight explains why, according to Shabait, when Eritreans celebrate their independence anniversary, Nakfa is the place that is cherished and remembered most. It wasn't just a location of one battle, it became the enduring embodiment of the possibility, and later the reality, of independence itself.
Yes, it's presented by Shabait as the place where the future state was, in a very real sense, born and nurtured under constant, almost unimaginable pressure. It's not just history remembered, it's a symbol kept alive.
Speaking of pressure, Shabait notes that Nakfa first fell into EPLF hands in 1977. That's a key date. But the really significant detail isn't just the capture, it's that it remained under EPLF control continuously until the very end of the struggle for independence in 1991, holding that single critical point for over 14 years through everything thrown at it. That must have been incredibly significant, both strategically and, well, morally.
Absolutely. Holding Nakfa against repeated massive assaults for well over a decade, as detailed in Shabait, transformed it. It went from merely captured territory into the ultimate symbol of defiance and resilience. It wasn't a temporary gain, it was a stronghold held steadfastly against overwhelming odds. It became, in Shabait's narrative, this powerful testament to the EPLF's strength, determination, and strategic capability. And importantly, it denied the enemy a crucial objective year after year after year.
And keeping it required immense, just back-breaking physical effort, right?
Right.
Building defenses under constant terrifying threat. Shabait provides some really striking details about the physical structures of resistance in Nakfa.
Oh yeah, the source paints a vivid picture. Ingenuity born of sheer necessity. Trenches, for instance, carved from huge rocks split by hoes and hammers and other small equipment. Just try to picture the sheer manual labor involved using basic hand tools, day after day, breaking apart solid rock to create defensive positions.
And this was happening, as Shabait points out, amidst the aerial bombings and shelling. So the construction itself was this incredibly dangerous act of resistance.
Absolutely. The act of building these defenses wasn't just logistics. It was an embodiment of perseverance under fire. And these were far from rudimentary ditches, you know. Shabait describes extensive underground facilities, care centers for the wounded, command posts for leadership and planning, holding stations for reserve fighter groups. These were vital subterranean complexes supporting the entire front.
So not just shallow trenches, but a sophisticated network of underground infrastructure built essentially by hand, out of rock.
Precisely. A vast network of tunnels, rooms, fortified positions carved out of the rock itself. And Shabait uses a really powerful phrase to capture the essence of these defenses and the effort behind them. Everything is breathtakingly inspiring. It conveys the sheer scale, the difficulty, and, well, the human spirit poured into creating this stronghold.
That really connects the physical place to the human element, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which leads us to the next layer of Nakfa significance, as described by Shabait. These structures weren't just physical protection, they were spaces where something deeper happened.
Exactly. Shabait emphasizes that these underground stone structures were far more than just shelters against bombs and bullets. They were the living spaces, the shared crucible where friendship were cemented, commitment and courage displayed, pain and hurt shared.
Wow. That image is incredibly powerful. These deep human bonds forged in the most extreme conditions imaginable, sharing not just space, but the profound emotional and physical toll of conflict.
It speaks to the intense communal life and shared experience that Shabait presents as fundamental to the collective effort. And Shabait makes a truly weighty statement about the significance of these specific places, saying they were the spaces where the fate for Eritrea and her people was laid.
Wow. The future destiny of an entire nation decided and shaped within these cramped, difficult underground rooms. Rooms painstakingly built from rock with hand tools. That directly links the personal struggle of those living there to the national outcome.
Shabait really elevates the daily life, the suffering, the communal existence of the fighters in Nakfa to the level of national destiny. It's presented as being within these harsh, protected, shared spaces that the very future of Eritrea was, in effect, being debated, decided upon, and actively built through sheer perseverance.
And from this base, the fighters faced just immense challenges. Shabait describes them as having gone through trying times, endured and fought and clambered up a steep slope to prove themselves strong. That metaphor of the steep slope, it really captures the difficulty, doesn't it?
It vividly suggests a continuous uphill struggle against immense difficulty, requiring constant, exhausting effort. It wasn't a level playing field, or an easy path to victory. It was a relentless climb against gravity, against overwhelming opposition towards that summit of independence.
And Shabait explicitly links this specific endurance and perseverance, forged in the harsh reality of Nakfa, to overcoming negative human qualities. It states this resilience helped Eritreans outlast subjugation, dependence, indecency, and other ignoble human qualities.
This is a crucial dimension highlighted by Shabait. The struggle wasn't just about military victory, it was also framed as this profound moral and psychological battle. The endurance developed in Nakfa wasn't merely about physical survival, it was presented as being about affirming human dignity, independence of spirit, and positive values in the face of an oppressive and degrading system. It powerfully intertwines the personal struggle with the narrative of national liberation.
And it was from this environment in Nakfa, starting back in 1977, according to Shabait, that a unique sense of nationalism and nationhood was born.
Yes, Shabait posits that the intense shared experience in Nakfa, the hardship, the living and working together in the underground structures, the collective defense of this vital stronghold, it acted as a crucible. It suggests that this specific environment fostered a potent, unifying collective identity and purpose, solidifying the idea of Eritrean into a distinct Eritrean nation with a shared destiny.
It's where the abstract idea of independence really took concrete form in the shared experience of a specific place.
Yeah.
And the fighters themselves, Shabait describes their mindset and resolve pretty clearly.
Yes, the source characterizes them as gallant fighters who possessed this unwavering determination. They knew nothing was to deter them, resolved to continue their struggle to the end until the occupation forces are routed out from Eritrea.
Shabait emphasizes that their strength wasn't solely external. It really stemmed from deep internal conviction. They understood that whatever the circumstance, their commitment, courage, tolerance, and readiness to face whatever challenge was what matters for them.
Right, that internal fortitude, that self-awareness of their own values and strengths, commitment, courage, tolerance, readiness, was, according to Shabait, the ultimate source of their power. It suggests a deep-seated belief in their cause and in themselves that could transcend external difficulties, losses, or the overwhelming power facing them. Their resilience came from within.
So Nakfa is captured in 77. It becomes this profound symbolic and physical heart of the resistance, fostering nationhood, embodying incredible endurance. It's natural then that the opposing side, the Ethiopian Derg regime, wouldn't simply accept this situation.
Absolutely not. Despite losing Nakfa, the Derg regime attempted repeatedly, over and over, to recapture and destroy the EPLF base there. And as Shabait explicitly states, these attempts miserably failed.
And those repeated failures must have come at a significant cost to the Derg's forces, wouldn't you think?
They certainly did. Shabait notes that these failed attempts left the enemy forces so weak. And this weakening had a crucial strategic consequence, according to the source. After Nakfa, the major towns and cities of Eritrea, except Asmara, Massawa, and Barentu, fell in the hands of the EPLF fighters.
Wow, that's a dramatic shift in control across the country. Holding Nakfa seems to have, in a way, drained the Derg's resources and morale, and the point where the EPLF could expand their control across most of the rest of Eritrea.
It certainly suggests that was a major factor. Nakfa remained the steadfast anchor, allowing the EPLF to consolidate and expand its position across a significant portion of Eritrea. Shabait even mentions that at this point, Asmara, the capital, became encircled and was looking for its final day. The struggle was reaching a potential climax with the EPLF in a seemingly dominant position.
But then a significant turning point occurred, as described by Shabait. Something changed the game.
Yes, the source notes that just as the EPLF appeared on the cusp of victory, the Derg regime received rescue from major powers, including the former Soviet Union, Cuba, South Yemen, and others.
So a major external intervention completely changed the dynamic of the conflict, preventing a potential EPLF victory at that specific moment.
According to Shabait, absolutely. The arrival of support from these international allies introduced a completely new level of resources, military hardware, and personnel backing for the Derg regime. It significantly altered the balance of power and, well, undoubtedly prolonged the conflict.
Okay, let's maybe delve into that external support a bit more and the nature of the Derg regime itself as it's presented in our source, Shabait.
Sure. Shabait explains that the Derg regime came to power in Ethiopia following the collapse of the Haile Selassie regime, emerging from something of a power vacuum in the country. The source notes that the Derg immediately claimed it was a communist regime and sided with the Soviet Union. And this political alignment, of course, was key to securing the subsequent external aid.
And that alignment brought the Derg regime access to just massive military resources, according to Shabait.
It really did. Shabait details the scale of the assistance provided by the Soviets and their allies. They began supplying the Derg regime with whatever military hardware fighter jets they felt enough to crash the EPLF forces.
Whatever they felt enough. That phrase suggests a potentially limitless or certainly vast scale of military supply, far beyond what the EPLF could likely match.
That phrase implies an intention to completely overwhelm the EPLF through sheer material superiority. It wasn't just a trickle of aid, it was a deliberate, massive infusion of military equipment. And the support wasn't limited to hardware either. Shabait notes that these external powers also trained hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Hundreds of thousands. That's an absolutely staggering number of personnel being trained and equipped specifically to fight against the EPLF. It dramatically highlights the scale of the force being arrayed against the liberation movement.
It really does. It shows that the conflict in Eritrea, from Shabait's perspective, became heavily influenced by broader geopolitical alignment and the willingness of major powers to invest significant resources, both material and human, into supporting the Derg regime.
And this immense external support, according to Shabait, directly fueled the Derg regime's confidence, didn't it?
Yes, Shabait states that the Derg regime was convinced it had the necessary military equipment and ready and trained personnel. With this level of backing, they clearly felt invincible.
Confident enough, in fact, to believe they could end the entire struggle very, very quickly.
Exactly. Shabait says they were utterly convinced they could crash the armed struggle for independence within days of the first offensive.
Hmm.
Well, they didn't anticipate a protracted war at all. They believed their newly acquired, externally backed military might would guarantee a swift, decisive victory.
Which brings us back to the cycle of military offensives. Despite the EPLF holding Nakfa and pushing back the enemy significantly, as Shabait describes it, the Derg, now bolstered by this massive external support, didn't abandon its objective of crushing the resistance.
Not at all. Shabait recounts that in their persistent bid to destroy the EPLF, the Derg regime launched a total of 7 separate major offensives. 7 large-scale military operations, each aimed at achieving that decisive victory they initially expected in, days.
7 major offensives. That demonstrates an incredible persistence, or maybe desperation, on the part of the Derg, especially given those earlier failures Shabait mentioned. And Shabait clarifies that even after being driven from Nakfa and other areas, the objective remained the same: regain control of key areas like Nakfa and wipe out the resistance once and for all.
Right. The struggle for Nakfa and the broader Sahel front, which was the anchor of the EPLF's defenses, remained this central, almost obsessive target for the Derg throughout these operations. Shabait refers to these attempts numerically, the first, second, through the sixth offensive, also noting the Derg's specific name for the monumental sixth offensive, Kaikokeb Operation, which means Red Star.
Okay, let's break down some of these earlier offensives then, as detailed in our source, Shabait. Starting with the first military offensive. This was launched after the EPLF had taken Nakfa and gained significant ground, right?
That's right. The first offensive was launched on June 13th, 1978. According to Shabait, it was a huge, multi-pronged attack. Initially launched from 4 fronts, though the source later seems to expand this to 6, highlighting the broad scope of the operation.
What were the specific directions and task forces involved in this initial major push, according to Shabait's account?
Okay, Shabait lists several distinct axes of advance. First, the 503 Task Force launched from Girhuserne, aiming towards Serena and Dekemhar. Second, another front pushed through Kasarika, Arikwala, and Mendefera with the explicit objective, Shabait says, of wiping out the EPLF forces in that corridor. Third, the 502 Task Force was tasked with marching through Shambuko and Gash towards Barentu. Fourth, the 501 Task Force was assigned to capture the town of Tessene, advancing through Omhajer. Then there was a 5th front, with the 505 Task Force directed to clear EPLF forces from the strategically important Semhar Plains, and crucially, a 6th front specifically directed through Dogali straight to the north, Nakfa.
So from the very first major offensive, despite their earlier failures to recapture it, Nakfa remained a primary direct target, attacked as part of this massive 6-front operation.
Absolutely. The Derg immediately prioritized reclaiming the strategic and symbolic ground they had lost. However, Shabait states that despite the scale, all 5 initial fronts, apparently excluding the Nakfa-bound 6th in this specific description of failure, were not able to hit their target due to the strong resistance they encountered from the liberation forces.
This must have been a huge shock, a real reality check for the Derg, given their earlier confidence in a swift victory based on their bolstered power.
It certainly seems so, according to Shabait. The source notes that the Derg regime had not the slightest clue that it would launch 7 military operations because they were so convinced it will crash the armed struggle for independence within days of the first offensive. Instead of scattered resistance, they were faced with determined and steadfast forces, as Shabait puts it.
And the immediate result of this strong resistance, what happened to that first offensive?
Well, the first military offensive, despite its immense scale and preparation, was foiled within days, according to Shabait. This forced the Derg to halt the offensive temporarily, to basically reorganize and reinforce its supplies and personnel, which had been badly depleted by their unexpected lack of success and the EPLF's tough resistance.
A significant early setback then, despite their apparent numerical and material superiority. What about the second military offensive? That followed soon after.
The second offensive was launched some months later, Shabait says, after the failure of the first. According to the source, this time the assault came from three principal directions. From the north through Adi Yaqub, from the east through Dogali, again highlighting that axis towards Nakfa Sahel, and from the west through Ingen towards Alphabet.
Okay, so adjusting their strategy, trying different fronts after the first failure,
Correct.
likely attempting to find weaker points or maybe different approaches. But the EPLF, according to Shabait, employed a strategic counter-move here.
They did. Shabait highlights what it calls the wise decision of the EPLF leadership to strategically withdraw during this operation.
That sounds counterintuitive, maybe, to our typical understanding of military strength. Why would withdrawal be considered a strength or a wise decision, as Shabait puts it?
Well, Shabait explains that this strategic withdrawal delivered one of the heavy blows to the Derg's appetite. The Derg, again confident they were finally going to engage and destroy the EPLF forces, advanced into vast areas only to find them deliberately emptied. They were left empty-handed, according to Shabait, and did not realize what the EPLF had in mind in conducting strategic withdrawal.
So it denied the Derg the pitched battles they were looking for, probably on their own terms. By withdrawing, the EPLF forced the Derg to extend the supply lines, occupy and try to control these large swaths of empty territory, potentially exposing them to different kinds of attacks later on. It seems the Derg maybe didn't grasp the EPLF's strategic depth beyond just direct confrontation.
Exactly. It suggests the EPLF leadership, as depicted by Shabait, was capable of complex strategic thinking that went beyond simply holding ground at all costs. They were using maneuver and space as tools of resistance.
Then came the third military offensive. Shabait places this in January 1979.
Right. According to Shabait, the primary objective of the third offensive was to gain control of Alphabet and the strategic northeast Sahel region, and crucially, to finally recapture Nakfa itself, which the Derg had failed to achieve for years by this point. Nakfa remained that key, elusive target.
So despite repeated failures, the objective of retaking Nakfa and controlling the Sahel front was just incredibly persistent for the Derg. And Shabait notes it was during this specific offensive that some of the most famous defensive structures were created.
Yes, exactly. Shabait notes that it was during this intense period, facing this renewed, determined push towards Nakfa and the Sahel, that the Dendon trenches in the Sahel front that we proudly talk about today were created. This really highlights the sheer pressure of this offensive, which necessitated the creation of those extensive and now historically significant defensive lines.
It really underlines how the landscape itself became marked by the intensity of the conflict, doesn't it? With these enduring defenses becoming permanent markers of the struggle in that region.
Absolutely. It shows the profound impact of the conflict on the physical environment and the incredible human effort required to defend against such determined assaults.
What followed was the fourth military offensive, still focused on this critical area, according to Shabait.
Yes, Shabait states that the fourth offensive was specifically aimed at penetrating the stronghold of Nakfa trenches. So this wasn't just an attempt to reach Nakfa, it was a direct assault on the heart of the fortified area, those underground defenses we discussed earlier.
Given the descriptions of those defenses carved from rock, extensive underground facilities attempting to directly penetrate them must have been incredibly difficult and costly for the attackers.
Shabait emphasizes the intensity and, frankly, the desperation of the Derg during this operation, noting they were so desperate that they were launching around 15 operations per day.
15 assaults per day, directed at the Nakfa trenches. That's an astonishing rate of attack. It conveys a sense of relentless pressure and a willingness to absorb massive casualties in a desperate attempt to break through.
It's a really vivid detail from Shabait that illustrates the sheer scale and intensity of the daily assaults on the Nakfa front during this particular offensive. However, according to the source, despite this unprecedented intensity, the outcome was grim for the Derg, with no result except heavy human and material losses.
An incredibly high price paid in lives and equipment for absolutely no strategic gain. That's a stark illustration of the effectiveness of the Nakfa defenses and the determination of the EPLF fighters holding them, as described by Shabait.
It really shows that even with overwhelming force and relentless pressure, the fortifications and the resolve of the defenders were, according to the source, sufficient to hold the line.
Following this costly failure came the fifth military offensive. What condition was the Derg regime in by this point, according to Shabait's account?
Shabait describes the regime as being so exhausted by the time the fifth offensive was underway. The cumulative cost of the previous four major offensives, the constant struggle to hold territory, the drain on resources, It was clearly taking a massive toll.
So much so that they had to resort to extraordinary measures just to even launch this offensive.
Yes, Shabait explicitly states that they were forced to bring soldiers from other places of Ethiopia to try and replenish their forces and make progress in this latest operation. This indicates the severe strain on their nationwide resources, pulling troops from other areas just to sustain the offensive in Eritrea.
And the result of this fifth offensive, despite these desperate measures.
According to Shabait, it was also crashed like those other offensives. Predictably, perhaps. This repeated failure, coming after such a clear demonstration of exhaustion and strain, led to a significant realization for the Derg regime. Shabait notes they recognized that with their energy emptied, they could do nothing more at that point and needed a substantial period to recover and rebuild, specifically 2 years for preparation for another military operation, just to regain some semblance of balance.
Wow. That 2-year pause is incredibly telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
It signifies that despite the massive external support, the cumulative effect of these repeated offensives and the steadfast EPLF resistance, particularly from strongholds like Nakfa and the Sahel Front, had completely drained the Derg's capacity to wage large-scale war, at least for a significant period.
It highlights, from Shabait's perspective, the effectiveness of the EPLF's strategy of attrition and defense. A strategy which forced the enemy to a standstill and necessitated a complete regrouping and massive replenishment of resources before they could even contemplate another major push.
And that significant period of regrouping brings us to the buildup for what Shabait describes as the colossal Sixth Offensive, known by the Derg regime as Red Star.
Yes, after that critical 2-year interval of intense preparation, the Sixth Offensive was launched in February 1982. Shabait refers to it as the much-anticipated operation, suggesting its scale and significance were widely understood beforehand. Everyone knew something huge was coming.
Yeah, given the 2 years of preparation after the exhaustion of the Fifth Offensive, it must have felt like the decisive make-or-break moment for the Derg.
Shabait certainly emphasizes its significance, stating it was the highest of all offensives ever launched by the Ethiopian regimes against the Eritrean revolution. The term highest here, in Shabait's context, seems to imply it involved the largest concentration of troops, the most expensive collection of military hardware, and was carried out with the greatest intensity compared to any previous operation directed against the EPLF. Just bigger in every way.
And those 2 years leading up to it weren't spent passively, just waiting around.
Not at all. Shabait details that during those 2 full years, the Derg regime dedicated its efforts to 2 primary areas: training new recruits on a massive scale to replace losses and build up numbers, and procuring vast amounts of military hardware from its international backers. They were rebuilding their forces and re-equipping on an unprecedented scale, specifically for this one operation.
But before the actual combat began, Shabait notes the Derg employed a different kind of weapon, didn't they? A significant propaganda campaign.
Yes, this is a crucial detail from Shabait. It shows the multifaceted nature of the Derg's assault. It wasn't solely about amassing physical force. There was a deliberate, large-scale psychological component aimed at weakening the enemy before the main attack even started. Before engaging in direct combat, the Derg used different propaganda means.
What methods did this propaganda effort involve, according to Shabait? What were they actually doing?
Shabait lists several methods: distributing pamphlets among the population and potentially the fighters themselves, disseminating messages widely through its mass media channels, radio, newspapers, things like that, and terrorizing the population through different means. That last one suggests a deliberate effort to instill fear beyond just words.
So a pretty comprehensive approach, targeting both the civilian support base and the fighters themselves. What were the specific goals of this widespread propaganda campaign, as stated by Shabait? What were they trying to achieve?
Shabait explicitly states the aims were dual. Firstly, aimed at terrorizing the population in a bid they will disassociate themselves from their sons and daughters who were fighting with the EPLF. Basically break that link between fighters and the people. The second aim was to incur terror and suspicion among the combatants of the EPLF forces themselves, sow doubt and fear within the ranks.
So they were trying to isolate the fighters from their essential civilian support network and simultaneously sow fear, distrust, and division within the EPLF's own ranks. A classic psychological warfare tactic, really, aimed at undermining the EPLF's internal cohesion and popular legitimacy before the military hammer blow fell.
Exactly. It demonstrates the Derg understood that the EPLF's strength wasn't purely military. It relied heavily on popular support and the unwavering morale and unity of its fighters. They were attempting to dismantle that foundation through psychological means first.
Despite the string of previous failures, Shabait indicates the Derg regime was incredibly confident going into this massive Sixth Offensive, almost overly confident.
Yes, Shabait notes that the Derg regime, perhaps misled by the power it assumed it had after those 2 years of massive preparation and external supply, was confident to annihilate the Eritrean liberation forces from the face of the earth.
Annihilate from the face of the earth. That phrase from Shabait really conveys an almost absolute belief in their capacity to utterly destroy the EPLF movement this time.
It reflects the scale of their preparations and the depth of their external backing. As Shabait reiterates, they were armed to the teeth, implying an overwhelming amount of weaponry and had the backing of some major superpowers.
And our source provides a crucial, specific detail about that external backing during the Red Star Offensive itself, doesn't it?
Yes, Shabait explicitly mentions the direct involvement of external military personnel, noting the presence of Soviet military advisors in the front line. This wasn't just receiving equipment or training from afar. This was direct tactical presence and guidance from a major superpowers personnel right there, where the fighting was taking place. It really highlights the international dimension of the conflict and the level of support the Derg received for this specific operation.
The sheer scale of this preparation, the visible backing from major powers, and this intense propaganda campaign. It must have had a significant psychological impact, even on observers, according to Shabait.
It seems so. Shabait notes that due to the perceived overwhelming nature of the Derg's buildup and propaganda, many believe that it was the end of the Eritrean people's struggle for independence, and the revolution will remain confined only to the books of history.
That's a powerful statement from Shabait. It indicates how effectively the sheer display of amassed power and the psychological warfare could shape perceptions, convincing many, maybe even outside observers, that the EPLF's cause was finally doomed.
And sadly, according to Shabait, this propaganda and the fear it generated did have a real-world consequence. And some were seen to shift sides with the Derg regime, convinced by the propaganda the regime was disseminating.
So the propaganda wasn't just empty noise. It actually managed to create division and persuade some individuals to abandon the EPLF cause. That highlights the immense pressure created by this pre-offensive campaign.
It really underscores the difficult environment the EPLF was operating in, facing not just a massive military threat, but a deliberate psychological attack aimed squarely at undermining their internal strength and external support.
And then, after all this buildup, all the preparation, the propaganda, the Sixth Offensive finally commenced.
According to Shabait, it was launched from all sides of Sahel front. This wasn't an attack on a single point or from one direction. It was an all-encompassing, massive assault designed to hit the entire defensive line, with Nakfa, of course, still being the anchor of that front.
The fighting that immediately followed is described by Shabait simply as so fierce.
Yes, indicating an immediate, incredibly intense and brutal conflict erupting across the entire front line from the moment the offensive was launched. The scale of the preparation translated directly into the intensity of the initial combat.
However, Shabait makes a crucial point about the EPLF's state of readiness, despite the secrecy and scale of the Derg's 2-year preparation.
Absolutely crucial. The source states that before the launch of the offensive, the EPLF leadership was well aware of the plan and intent of the Derg regime. This intelligence capability was clearly vital.
So, despite the massive, secretive buildup and the elaborate propaganda trying to sow confusion, the EPLF leadership knew what was coming. That's invaluable intelligence that allowed them to prepare, presumably.
It allowed them to be proactive rather than simply reactive. Shabait mentions the EPLF wasn't just waiting passively behind their defenses. They were actively engaged in conducting sporadic attacks from behind the enemy position and in the front line before the full offensive was even unleashed.
Attacking the enemy during their final stages of buildup and concentration, trying to disrupt their preparations and movements before they could launch.
Precisely. They weren't waiting for the attack to hit them. They were already actively engaging the enemy to disrupt their plan and timing. And the effect of these proactive measures, according to Shabait, was significant. These preemptive attacks helped minimize and break the morale and capacity of the enemy forces, even before the main, massive Red Star offensive formally began.
So, the EPLF, armed with intelligence, wasn't just hunkering down. They were actively undermining the enemy's strength, morale, and carefully laid plans, even in the face of this unprecedented military buildup and psychological assault.
It shows a strategic response that combined intelligence, proactive engagement, and likely leveraging the difficult terrain of the Sahel front and the strength of their prepared defenses. They were actively shaping the battlefield and the enemy's condition before the main event even kicked off.
And that intense pre-offensive maneuvering and the very beginning of the massive Sixth Offensive, Red Star, that feels like a natural place to pause for this first part of our deep dive. We've explored, based entirely on our source, Shabait, Nakfa's profound symbolic meaning as the very foundation of the Eritrean state, the incredible, painstaking human effort involved in building and holding its defenses under constant fire, and how this vital place fostered a unique national identity. We've also traced the intense, multi-year military conflict focused on Nakfa and the Sahel front, detailing the repeated, costly, and failed Derg offensives, leading up to that massive 2-year buildup, the pervasive propaganda campaign, and the initial stages of the colossal Red Star offensive itself.
That's right. And all of this information, it's important to keep reminding ourselves, and you, the listener, comes from our single source for this deep dive, Shabait. It provides a specific, detailed perspective on these pivotal events and the enduring significance of Nakfa within this particular narrative.
And as we mentioned at the top, this is just the beginning of the story of the Red Star Offensive and what followed, covered here in Part 1 based on the Shabait source. In the next part of this deep dive, we'll continue following Shabait's account, exploring the fierce fighting of the Sixth Offensive itself, its outcome, and what unfolded after this pivotal moment in the long struggle for independence, again, based entirely on the details provided in our source material.
Yeah, the Sixth Offensive, described as the highest ever launched and backed by significant external powers and that intense psychological warfare. It really represents the ultimate test of the EPLF's resilience and strategic depth, centered around those key strongholds like Nakfa.
So, based on Shabait's account that we've explored today, which describes this overwhelming external force, vast resources, extensive preparation, pervasive propaganda being brought to bear, yet repeatedly challenged by determined resistance, strategic ingenuity like withdrawal and preemptive strikes, and an unwavering internal belief rooted in a place like Nakfa. Maybe consider this for our next deep dive. What does this narrative, as presented by Shabait, tell us about the relative power of sheer material and numerical superiority versus the intangible forces of unwavering belief, adaptability, ingenuity, and human spirit when facing seemingly insurmountable pressure? How does this specific account from Shabait maybe challenge conventional ideas about what determines the outcome of conflict?
It definitely raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? About the weight of material might versus the resilience and conviction of a people fighting for what they believe in, at least as depicted in our source.
Something to mull over as we get ready to continue this story from the Shabait source in Part 2.